I was 26 years old and I thought I had my life figured out. I had a good job, a decent apartment in Columbus, Ohio, and a girlfriend named Mara Calloway who was smart and beautiful and who loved me in the steady, reliable way that most people spend years looking for. We had been together for 2 years. Her parents liked me. My mother adored her. Every person who knew us said we looked right together, and I believed them because from the outside we did. I want to be honest about that before I say anything else. I loved Mara. Not in a complicated way, not in a way I had to talk myself into. I just loved her. She made things easy. She laughed at the right moments and knew when to be quiet and never made me feel like I was being graded. 2 years in and I still looked forward to seeing her at the end of the day. That is not nothing. That is actually everything most people are chasing. So when Mara told me in early September that her younger sister was coming home, I had no reason to feel anything about it except mild curiosity. Her name was June Calloway. She had been living in Edinburgh, Scotland for 3 years, doing some kind of graduate research program in environmental science. Mara talked about her the way older siblings talk about younger ones who went and did something unexpected. Proud, slightly competitive, genuinely impressed but unwilling to fully show it. She said June was brilliant and a little strange and very hard to get a hold of because she kept odd hours and forgot to charge her phone. I nodded and said she sounded interesting and went back to whatever I was doing. I was not prepared. That is the only way I know how to say it now. She arrived on a Friday evening in the second week of September. Mara and I drove to the Calloway house together, a wide 2-story colonial on the east side of town where Mara had grown up and where her parents still lived. I had been to that house probably 40 times. I knew which step on the porch creaked and where the good coffee mugs were kept, and that Mara's father watched football at a volume that made conversation impossible after 7. I pulled into the driveway and Mara was already getting out of the car before I had the engine off, moving toward the front door with the particular speed of someone who has been waiting for something for a long time. I followed at a normal pace. The front door was open. I could hear voices inside, Mara's mother, then Mara, then a laugh I did not recognize. Not loud, just easy, the kind of laugh that does not ask for anything from the room. I walked in and there she was. June Calloway was standing in the hallway with a duffel bag over one shoulder and her hair, dark brown and slightly damp from what I guessed was a long travel day, pushed back from her face. She was wearing a gray sweatshirt with a university name on it that I did not catch and jeans that had a small tear at the left knee, and she was hugging Mara with one arm because the other was still holding the bag, and she was laughing at something Mara had just whispered to her. She looked up when I walked in. We had never met before. Mara had shown me pictures, but pictures had not prepared me for the particular way June Calloway looked at a person when she first saw them. Like she was genuinely interested. Like she was paying attention not just to what you looked like, but to what you might be like under that. "Hi," she said. "You must be Ethan." "I am," I said. "It is good to finally meet you." And that was it. That was the whole thing. 30 seconds in a hallway, a handshake, a brief smile, and then everyone moved toward the kitchen where dinner was already on the stove and Mara's father was asking June about her flight and June was answering with the comfortable ease of someone who had been traveling her whole life. I sat down at the kitchen table and told myself I felt nothing unusual. I almost believed it. Dinner was loud and warm the way Calloway dinners always were. Mara's father, Glenn, grilled June about her research in the specific way that fathers interrogate children they are proud of but will not say so directly. Her mother, Carol, kept refilling everyone's water and touching June's arm every few minutes like she needed to confirm she was actually there. Mara sat close to me and leaned her head on my shoulder twice during the meal, and I put my arm around her each time, and everything looked exactly the way it was supposed to look. June sat across the table. She did not talk too much or too little. She answered her father's questions without performing for him. She teased Mara about something that had happened when they were teenagers, some incident involving a canoe in a state park, and the whole table laughed and I laughed too, and June caught my eye across the table and smiled at the joke, just a regular smile, and I looked away first. I do not know why I looked away first. After dinner, I helped Glenn clear the table while Mara and June and Carol moved to the living room. I could hear them through the wall, all 3 voices overlapping. That specific sound of a family recalibrating around someone who had been missing for a while. I washed the pot on the stove because Glenn never remembered to soak it first, and I knew where the dish soap was kept, and I was glad to have something specific to do with my hands. Glenn stood next to me drying a pan and said, "Good kid, that one. Different from Mara but good. She sees things." I said, "Yeah. She seems great." He nodded and put the pan away, and that was the end of that. On the drive home, Mara talked the whole way. About how good June looked. How much more settled she seemed than before she left. How she had been worried for no reason. I listened and agreed and asked the right questions and meant most of what I said. I went to bed that night and stared at the ceiling for 20 minutes before I fell asleep. I told myself I was just tired. I told myself that for a long time after that. I made a decision without fully admitting I was making one. I would be friendly but distant. Present at family dinners but not seeking out conversation. Polite in the way you are polite to your girlfriend's family members, which means warm enough that nobody notices anything and careful enough that nothing goes anywhere it should not. I had no reason to think anything would go anywhere. I was just being cautious the way a person is cautious when they sense a road that is slightly unfamiliar and decide to stick to the path they know. That is what I told myself in the first 2 weeks after June came home. The problem was that June was not particularly easy to be distant from. Not because she pursued anything. She did not. She was not flirtatious or seeking or trying in any visible way to take up more space than she was given. She was just herself in a way that was unusually hard to ignore. She asked questions that were actually interesting. She listened to the answers in a way that made you feel like you had said something worth hearing. She read constantly and left books in strange places around the house, and sometimes when I picked one up to move it, I would see her notes in the margins, small and neat, asking questions back at the text. I put the books down without reading the notes. That felt important. Mara noticed none of this because there was nothing to notice. I was doing everything right. I showed up to Sunday dinners and said the correct things and drove Mara home and kissed her goodnight and answered her texts promptly. I was, by any visible measure, a good boyfriend in the middle of a normal autumn. Inside, I was having a conversation I could not stop. Not with June. With myself. About June. About the specific way she had said something at dinner the previous Sunday about how glaciers calve. About how the sound they make when they break is the loudest natural sound most people will never hear in their lives. She had said it quietly, not performing, just telling us something she found worth knowing. And I had thought about it for 3 days afterward. Not about her. About the glaciers. That was what I told myself. The night that ended all of that happened on a Wednesday in October. Mara had an early morning meeting the next day and had gone home by 9. I had stayed later than usual because Glenn had wanted to show me something wrong with his truck, and I knew enough about engines to be useful. By the time we figured out it was the alternator, it was close to 10 and Glenn had gone to bed and Carol had gone up an hour before that, and I was in the kitchen getting my jacket off the back of the chair when I heard someone come down the stairs. June appeared in the kitchen doorway in socks and an oversized flannel shirt, holding an empty mug. She stopped when she saw me. "Oh," she said. "I thought everyone had left." "Almost," I said. "I was just heading out." She nodded and moved to the counter and filled her mug from the kettle that was still warm. She did not seem uncomfortable. She never seemed uncomfortable. That was one of the things I had noticed without wanting to. I put on my jacket. She said, without turning around, "How long have you and Mara been together?" 2 years, I said. "A little over." She turned around then and leaned against the counter and held the mug with both hands. "She is good at being loved," June said. "She always has been. She knows how to receive it without being weird about it. Some people cannot do that." I stood there with my jacket half on. I said, "That is an interesting way to put it." She shrugged. "I think about how people move through relationships the way I think about ecosystems. What they take, what they give back, whether the whole thing is sustainable. Mara is sustainable. She does not drain things." I finished putting my jacket on. I did not leave. That was the moment. Not a dramatic one. No music, no lightning, no look that lasted too long. Just a kitchen at 10 o'clock at night and a woman saying something true in a way that landed differently than things usually landed. And a man who should have said goodnight and walked out the door and instead sat down at the kitchen table. We talked for an hour and 40 minutes. I know the exact time because I checked my phone when I finally stood up to leave and I saw that it was 11:47 and I felt something drop through me that was not quite guilt yet but was practicing to become it. We talked about her research and about what it felt like to live somewhere foreign for 3 years and whether you ever fully come back from that or whether some part of you stays located somewhere else permanently. She said she thought a piece of her was still standing on a hillside outside Edinburgh looking at the North Sea, and she was not entirely sure that was a problem. I told her about a summer I spent working on a fishing boat in Alaska at 21, before I had figured anything out, and how that was the last time I had felt completely in the present tense. She said she understood that exactly. She did not ask why I had sat back down. I did not explain it. When I finally left, she walked me to the door the way you walk someone to the door in your parents' house, just out of ordinary politeness, and she said, "It was good to talk to you, Ethan." And I said the same thing, and I meant it in a way that scared me on the drive home. I did not tell Mara about the conversation. Not that night, not the next day. I told myself there was nothing to tell. Two people talked in a kitchen. That happened all the time. But I drove home a different way than usual. Longer route. I needed the extra minutes before I had to be anywhere, before I had to be any particular version of myself. I drove and I did not think about glaciers. I thought about everything else. I pulled back from everything after that night. I stopped going to Sunday dinners. The first time I said I had a work deadline, which was partly true. The second time I said I was not feeling well, which was not true at all. Mara accepted both without question because she had no reason not to, and that made it worse somehow, the ease with which I could move around her trust. I was not proud of any of it. The truth was simpler and harder than I wanted it to be. I had sat in a kitchen with June Calloway for an hour and 40 minutes and talked the way I had not talked to anyone in years, maybe ever, and now I could not unfeel that, and because I could not unfeel it I was building a wall around the whole thing and hoping the wall would hold. It did not hold. Mara noticed the distance before she named it. She mentioned it once, lightly, on a Thursday evening when I came over for dinner and spent most of it on my phone dealing with something at work that genuinely needed handling but that I also did not try very hard to put away. She said, "You have been somewhere else lately." I said I was sorry and put the phone down and stayed fully present for the rest of the evening, and she seemed satisfied and I felt like the worst version of myself. The thing about guilt is that it is loudest in the silence. During the actual days when I was working and moving and filling time with tasks, I could manage it. It was the quiet moments that broke through. Lying next to Mara on a Saturday morning while she slept and feeling the specific weight of knowing that something had shifted in me, and that she did not know yet, and that not telling her was its own form of wrong. I had not done anything. That was the true and useless fact I kept returning to. Nothing had happened. No line had been crossed. June and I had talked in a kitchen once and gone our separate ways and had not been alone together since. By any reasonable definition of the word, I had behaved. I had stayed. I was still here. But I was lying in the way that people lie when they tell the truth and leave out the most important part. 3 weeks after the kitchen, Mara asked me directly. We were sitting in my apartment on a Sunday night, not doing anything in particular, and she turned to me from her side of the couch and said, "Is there something going on with you?" And not in a vague way. In the way that meant she had been thinking about how to say this for a while and had decided that tonight was the night. I looked at her. Her face was patient and careful and slightly braced, the face of someone who has already begun preparing for an answer they do not want. I said, "I think I need to be honest with you about something." I told her about the conversation in the kitchen, all of it as accurately as I could. The hour and 40 minutes, the things we talked about, the way it had felt, the way I had driven home afterward and not been able to stop thinking about it. I did not dress it up and I did not make myself sound better than I was. I said nothing happened because nothing had. I also said that something felt different for me and I did not know what to do with that and I was ashamed that I was sitting here telling her this. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I know." I looked at her. She said, "I did not know what it was exactly, but I knew something was different. I could feel it." She paused. "The thing that hurts is not what you did or did not do in that kitchen. The thing that hurts is that you came home that night and you looked at me differently and you thought I could not see it." I said her name. She held up one hand. Not unkindly, just firmly. She said, "I am not angry at June. I want you to know that. I do not think she did anything wrong and I am not going to treat her like she did. But I cannot be with someone who is in my apartment and already somewhere else. That is not fair to either of us. She stood up and got her coat from the hook by the door, and she put it on with the quiet, deliberate movements of someone holding themselves very carefully together. She turned back to me at the door. She said, "You are a good person, Ethan. You told me the truth when you did not have to. That matters. But it does not fix this." Then she left. I sat on that couch for a long time after the door closed. The apartment felt different with her gone. Not empty exactly, just honest in a way it had not been before. Like the air pressure had changed and everything was still settling. I did not call June. I did not reach out in any direction. I just sat there and let it be as bad as it was. What happened next I heard about in pieces, from mutual friends and eventually from a brief, careful text from Mara herself. June had found out. Not from me, but from Mara, who had gone home that night and, instead of falling apart privately, had sat down with her sister and told her everything. Not to punish her, just because she believed in honesty more than I probably deserved in that moment. June left Columbus 3 days later. Not back to Edinburgh, just away. A friend's place in Portland, Oregon. She told her parents she needed time and they gave it to her because they were that kind of family, the kind that lets people disappear when they need to and trusts that they will come back. I heard nothing from her directly. The silence had a particular shape to it. The kind that means someone is not just busy but actively choosing not to speak. I understood it. I did not blame her for it. I had been the one sitting at that kitchen table. I had been the one who stayed. I went to work and came home and cooked dinner alone and did not date anyone and did not try to explain myself to people who had not asked. Some things do not need an audience. Some things you just have to carry until they get lighter. The months passed the way months do when you are not sure what you are waiting for. Slowly at first, then all at once. The first time I spoke to Mara again after the breakup was in February. For months later. She called me on a Sunday afternoon, which surprised me. I picked up on the second ring because I had promised myself when we ended things that I would always answer if she called. It seemed like the least I could do. She sounded like herself. That was the first thing I noticed. Not fragile. Not angry. Just Mara. Steady and direct. Calling with a purpose. She said she wanted me to know that she and June were okay. That it had taken time and more than one difficult conversation, but that they had gotten there. She said, "I do not want you carrying around guilt about what happened between me and my sister. We sorted that out ourselves. That belongs to us, not you." I said I was glad. I meant it completely. She said one more thing before she hung up. She said, "June is moving back to Columbus in the spring. She got a research position at Ohio State. I thought you should know so you are not caught off guard if you run into her." I thanked her for telling me. I sat with that information for a long time after the call ended. Spring arrived the way it does in Columbus, reluctantly at first and then all at once, trees going from bare to full in what felt like a single week. I went about my life. I took on a bigger project at work. I started running again, something I had abandoned in the fall. I called my mother more often. I did small, ordinary things that added up to feeling slightly more like a person who deserved good things. I did not look for June. I want to be clear about that because it matters. I did not engineer a meeting or find out where she was working or position myself anywhere near her life. Whatever happened next had to happen on its own or not at all. That felt like the one thing I could get right. It happened on a Tuesday evening in late April. I was at a bookstore on High Street, the small independent one near my apartment that I had been going to for years. I was looking for something by an author my coworker had recommended, and I could not remember the exact title, and I was standing in the middle of an aisle holding my phone trying to look it up when someone at the end of the aisle said, "Ethan." I looked up. June Calloway was standing about 8 feet away holding a book with both hands, her hair slightly longer than I remembered, wearing a blue jacket I had never seen before. She looked like herself. She also looked like someone who had been through something and come out the other side of it and was still figuring out what that meant. We looked at each other for a moment. "Hey," I said. "Hey," she said back. Neither of us moved for a second. Then she held up the book in her hands. "I am looking for something on watershed restoration," she said. "This one might be too technical." I looked at the cover. "Probably," I said. But sometimes too technical is exactly what you need. She almost smiled at that. Almost. We stood in that aisle for a few minutes, talking the way people talk when they have history that is too complicated to address in a bookstore and both of them know it. We did not address it. We talked about her new position, about what watershed restoration actually meant in practical terms, about the author I was looking for whose name she recognized and whose other book she said was better than the one my coworker had recommended. When it got to the point where the conversation had run its natural course and we were both going to have to either say goodbye or say something real, she said, "I think about that night sometimes." I said, "Me too." She looked at me steadily. Not with accusation, just honestly. She said, "I am not angry anymore. I want you to know that. I was for a while. Not really at you, more at the whole situation, at myself for not handling it better. But that passed." I said, "I am sorry for the part one played in all of it." She nodded slowly. At some point the coffee place started stacking chairs around us and we looked up and realized we were the last people there. We walked out together and stood on the sidewalk in the dark and she said, "Same time next week?" I said, "Yes." She nodded once, the way she did when something was decided, and then she walked toward her car and I walked toward mine and I did not watch her go the way I had watched her go before, with that specific ache of something unclaimed. This time it felt different. Not unclaimed. Just beginning. Patient and real and built on ground that had actually been cleared. No pretending, no borrowed time, no one else in the room. 3 months later I reached across a restaurant table and took her hand and she let me, and that was the whole story in a single moment. No grand declaration. No dramatic reversal. Just two people who had gone the long way around to something true. Sitting in a quiet room in Columbus, Ohio, finally, carefully, choosing each other for real. And it was enough. It was more than enough. It was exactly what it was supposed to be.